Hello and welcome to our webinar on the Early Detection and Diagnosis of Cancer Roadmap. We'd like to remind attendees that you can tweet us at CRUK Research using the hashtag #EDDRoadmap. We'll be kicking off the event with a welcome from Ian Fowkes, who's the Executive Director of Research and Innovation at Cancer Research UK, and a patient perspective from Patrick Maguire. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everyone to this virtual event titled A Roadmap to the Future of Early Detection and Diagnosis. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Ian Fowkes and I'm Executive Director of Research and Innovation at Cancer Research UK. Now, if we're to beat cancer, early detection and diagnosis are among the most effective means we have at our disposal. We know that patients diagnosed with cancer at an early stage have the best chance of successful treatment and long-term survival. If we take bowel cancer, for example, something like 92% of patients diagnosed with the disease at stage 1 survive at least 5 years, compared to only 10% of patients who are diagnosed at stage 4. In England, we're only diagnosing just over half of patients at an early stage, so there's a huge opportunity for improvement. Now, early detection research is a comparatively new and fragmented field, and the field is beset by a historic lack of research funding and infrastructure. It's why we made it a priority at Cancer Research UK back in 2014 when we launched our research strategy, and we've seen our investment increase over fourfold since. We've also seen a lack of industry investment due to high research and development costs, significant regulatory hurdles, and also unclear adoption pathways into the health system. And that means overall, early detection and diagnosis is somewhat undervalued by health systems around the world. Now, the roadmap for the early detection and diagnosis of cancer presents a shared vision from discovery to implementation for a long-term future in which early detection and diagnosis of all cancers is a routine reality. It shows how government, industry, charities and researchers can come together and implement new approaches that could save lives on a huge scale. The opportunity in early detection and diagnosis is now being recognised by UK government with ambitious targets set in the NHS England's long-term plan, and also within the Scottish Government's Beating Cancer strategy. If we get it right, early detection and diagnosis of cancer could be a game changer for patients everywhere, revolutionising their health outcomes with the real opportunity and potential for extending and saving lives. Now, to start the event today, we'd like to reflect on the impact a late cancer diagnosis can have on patients and the potential offered by early detection and diagnosis. So we're now going to hear from Patrick, who's going to share his story and his insights into how the early detection of cancer can change lives. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
This is a photograph of my wife Pam. Over 18 months she visited our doctor 3 times with symptoms of abdominal discomfort and fatigue. 3 times she was misdiagnosed. She was eventually admitted to hospital through accident and emergency, where she was diagnosed with terminal bowel cancer and died just 12 months later, aged just 52. Such events obviously devastate families, and I wanted to do as much as I could to ensure that as few families as possible went through the devastating experience we went through. So I began volunteering and fundraising for Cancer Research UK. I soon learned what a huge difference early diagnosis of cancer makes. I learned that if Pam's cancer had been diagnosed at the earliest stage, she would have had a more than 90% chance of survival for 10 years or more. But diagnosed so late, she had a less than 10% chance of survival. She never got to realise her ambition of travelling the world with me on her retirement. She never got to see her son graduate or her daughter married. She never got to meet her 3 wonderful grandchildren. In the United Kingdom, our government has set a target of 75% of all cancers to be diagnosed at the earliest stage by 2028. Sadly, there's been little action so far, but if that one target alone was met, that would save 55,000 lives per year. I could quote so many more statistics about early diagnosis, but behind every statistic, there's a real person, a real family. Early diagnosis means more couples spending more time together. It means families sharing special occasions. It means more grandchildren being spoiled by more grandparents. In over 10 years of volunteering, I've had the huge privilege to meet so many doctors, nurses, researchers and scientists, and I've been inspired by their commitment, dedication and determination to improve cancer outcomes. Along with many, many thousands of Cancer Research UK supporters, I share those ambitions. So we'll keep doing what we do. Please keep doing what you do. And together we'll continue to make a difference. Together we'll transform people's lives, and together we will beat cancer.
Good morning, everyone. My name is David Crosby. I'm Head of Prevention and Early Detection Research at Cancer Research UK. And I'd like to start by saying thank you so much to Patrick for sharing his moving story and his insight with us. I think Patrick's story is an all too poignant reminder of the devastating impact that receiving a late diagnosis can have on patients and their families. And it really highlights the importance of developing the early detection approaches and technologies that can really help us tackle this devastating disease. So I'd like to now move on to tell you what's coming up today. I'm going to be walking you through how and why we set about creating this early detection and diagnosis roadmap. And we'll briefly delve into its recommendations for how we can all work together to try and achieve progress. We'll then be joined, I'm delighted to say, by Susan Galbraith, who's the Senior Vice President for Early Oncology at AstraZeneca. Susan's going to be discussing the opportunities for industry in the early detection and diagnosis space and how E&D will change the business model for pharma. I'm then happy to say that we're honoured to be joined by Professor Peter Johnson, NHS England's National Clinical Director for Cancer. Peter's going to be highlighting the unmet need within the NHS and the potential for early detection and diagnosis to really revolutionise healthcare for cancer. Now, throughout all of these talks, we're going to be highlighting the numerous and varied opportunities for you as researchers and members of industry to engage in a collaborative process which can really drive forward progress. After those talks, we're going to be joined by Fergus Gleeson, Caroline Dive and Jodie Moffat for a live question and answer panel discussion. And in that panel discussion, we'll take questions around the talks we've heard, around the roadmap and what we can do together to achieve progress. Please do submit your questions for that live event question and answer session. You can submit those at any time throughout the talks using the Q&A function. And also, once the questions have been submitted, you have the opportunity to upvote them by pressing the like button. So there's a kind of thumbs up icon. If you see a question you like that you want us to relay to the panel, click that icon. The more votes it gets, the more likely we are to ask it. So now into the main body of the webinar itself, where I'll be going first to tell you a bit about the roadmap. Next slide, please. So why is this a challenge? Why do we need a roadmap? Well, the early detection of cancer is crucial, as we've heard from Ian in the introductory talk. And if it's so important, why haven't we cracked it? Why is there a gulf between the rates of early diagnosis that we aspire to and the reality that we face in the clinic? Well, it's hard is the short answer. There's a great deal of biological complexity and uncertainty around the earliest lesions and the pre-malignant course. The concentrations of markers that we have available in the system to find vanishingly small is a huge signal to noise challenge. Because of this complexity, because it's such a tough nut to crack, it's arguably been under prioritized through public sector funding, through third sector funding, through industry funding. Perhaps not as much investment and attention has been dedicated to early detection over the years as has been to therapeutic development, for example. It's been seen as somewhat of a pipe dream. There are a host of challenges then within the system itself. Even when technologies are developed, there isn't as well trodden a pathway to evaluation and implementation in the health system for detection approaches as there is for drugs, for example. So this creates barriers to translation and implementation. And overall, that's led to a lack of scale of efforts, with perhaps too many small-scale projects looking for markers, looking for detection technologies that have failed to bridge that valley of death to validation in large-scale studies. Next slide, please. So all of that speaks to a kind of a fragmentation of effort, with pockets of great stuff going on across academia and industry and wider the wider ecosystem, but a lack of integration of that effort. So Cancer Research UK set itself the challenge of really trying to develop a landmark strategic long-term plan for the early detection and diagnosis of cancer in the UK, and that's the roadmap. We went about this by a very, very broad and deep consultation. It's really important to emphasise that this roadmap is not a CR UK strategy. We didn't sit down and just write it one day. This was the result of a consultation of over 100 experts across the ecosystem that's going to be necessary to make this happen. We consulted academia, we consulted industry, we consulted regulators, we consulted investors, we consulted the health system in the NHS, the decision makers, government, and crucially patients and the public to get that complete view. And the roadmap is the result of that wide and deep consultation. It's a shared vision for where a future in 15, 20 years time where early detection of all cancers is a routine reality. It aims to highlight the current challenges and the barriers impeding progress towards that future vision. And most importantly, it provides a series of tangible recommendations, specific actions that we as a community need to take in order to reach that future vision. Next slide, please. As I said, we consulted very deeply in order to develop this vision. We were led by an expert steering committee chaired by the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty. Obviously, this process began before his day job got a hell of a lot busier. We had many field-leading experts across academia, industry, and beyond on that steering committee. We held a 2-day workshop, again, 80 participants. We consulted numerous stakeholder groups and organisations, input across the spectrum from basic science through translation to the health system to government policy and regulation. And again, I just really want to emphasise the importance of patient and public perspectives. Early detection will not become a reality unless we engineer a system which is inclusive of every part of our society, which reaches people, engages them with their health, with wanting early detection, and understands what the public wants and understands and will accept from an early detection system. Next slide, please. So just at a high level, I shan't walk you through each individual recommendation in the document, and I'm sure you've all seen it, but at a high level, the themes that it touches on are, firstly, understanding risk and prognosis from biology to technology. So this is about understanding who is most at risk of cancer and how we can use biological insight and technological approaches to assess that risk and model that in to the way that we use tests and the way that we interpret results of tests to then appropriately triage and deal with folks. The second part of that is prognosis. I believe it's the case that the more screening type technologies come online, the more we're going to be finding earlier and earlier lesions where there is inherent uncertainty about their disease course. And that covers, the kind of pre-malignant lesions like DCIS in breast, and also the very earliest truly malignant lesions. We're not certain for very many of those, which are going to go on to become the lethal cancers, and which are going to be the more indolent lesions that one might die with rather than from. So having the biological insight and the technologies to make those prognostic predictions is going to be crucially important. And there are recommendations in the roadmap about how we can address those issues. The second theme is biomedical data science and systems. This is about unlocking the potential of the NHS as a data resource for assessing risk and for finding the people that we should be testing to try and find cancers earlier, but also about using novel data streams and bringing online and integrating not just the health records of the NHS, but information from perhaps genotyping, from personal data sources like your personal activity monitors, your mobile phones, your internet search history, whatever else could have informative signal in it, again, in order for us to risk stratify and to detect and to prognose. The third theme is around incentivizing and supporting development and commercialization. As I've said, there's a kind of market failure around early detection with too few new technologies making it through into practice. And so the report makes recommendations around how we can support small businesses in growing and bringing through innovative early detection and diagnostic technologies, and then how we can support the industry as a whole to give them clear sets of goalposts and a viable health economic model that works for the NHS and for business to get technologies into practice. And the last theme is around healthcare system innovation and adoption. So this is the coalface, the reality of early detection and diagnosis in the NHS, and how we need an evolution of the system to be ready to implement novel technologies as they come online, to evolve its offering really from treatment, identification and treatment of symptomatic disease, to a new model of health maintenance based on detection of very early disease in the asymptomatic. And that's really quite a new way of thinking for the NHS, and so there are structural evolutions that need to happen to accommodate that, which again the report makes recommendations around. Next slide, please. The final set of recommendations in the report are not for scientists, but for the UK government, and there are 6 recommendations that it makes for government policy change or evolution to support research, development and implementation of early detection and diagnosis approaches. Now, I won't read through each one of these, but we've highlighted the market failure aspect already. Workforce in the NHS is of course crucial. We need the diagnostic staff and technologies right now to deliver the early detection approaches that we know work, but also to have enough capacity in the system to enable research. The NHS has endless potential as a world-leading platform for early detection and diagnosis research, but it needs appropriate investment to be able to support that. Next slide, please. So the last point I wanted to emphasise is that, again, this is not a CI UK initiative. We helped to convene this process, but the recommendations that the report makes and the goals that it sets are for the ecosystem as a whole. And we've shotgunned a bunch of logos onto the screen here to try and give a picture of the breadth of players that need to be involved in this. And there's investment on the public sector side through UKRI and others, investment from the charitable sector highlighted by ourselves, but also the AMRC and kind of charities more broadly. Industry, of course, has a core role to play in this. Nothing gets to a patient without a company being involved. So we represent that here by the trade associations, ABHI, BIVDA and ABPI, but of course there's 101 companies involved in this space, and no single organization is going to be able to affect meaningful change alone. So if you take one message away from this workshop, it's about the need for collaboration across organizations, across sectors, to make this a reality. Next slide, please. And yeah, that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. And next up, I'm going to be handing you over to Susan Galbraith. Susan is the Vice President for Early Oncology at AstraZeneca. Thank you very much indeed, Susan, for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you. I want to talk to you a little bit about the industry perspective on the opportunities and challenges for the early detection and treatment of cancer. And I think the first thing to say is there is plenty of opportunity here, and the opportunity follows the technological improvements that we've got for detecting cancer. So just go on to the next slide, please. So here's the the output of what we've got in terms of 5-year survival rates in the UK for a range of different cancers. And the good news is that the 5-year survival rates over the last couple of decades have been improving. There are some cancer types like melanoma and breast cancer where if they're caught early, a really very high proportion of patients can expect to survive more than 5 years. There are other cancers where we've made significant progress, but we're still in the mid-range, such as bowel cancer and leukemia. And then we've got lung cancer. That's one of the ones we've picked out here at the bottom. But even there, we're starting to see an uptick in survival curves, but we're well below the levels that we can see with breast cancer. And the truth is, we also remain lower than international comparators. So what can we do about it? Next slide, please. So this is the fundamental process that we're up against, which is the evolution of cancer, and the fundamental reason, which is if we try and treat cancer at an earlier stage, we're much more likely to have a bigger impact on the long-term survival outcome. As cancers evolve, they gain more and more different mutations that they can become resistance mechanisms for whatever therapy is targeted. So if we target early and a truncal event, so one of the common events throughout the clones of the cancer, we're much more likely to be able to affect really deep responses, regressions of the cancer, and long-term survival, and potentially cure. Next slide. So that's actually the fundamental component of the strategy that we have at AstraZeneca Oncology, which is to hit cancer earlier and to move our programs much earlier in the stage of the disease faster than we have historically. To hit it harder with the appropriate combinations by understanding resistance mechanisms, either the appropriate combinations or sequences, which I think is an important thing to think about. And then to be smarter in how we understand how to treat the resistance mechanisms, adapting to the increase in other clones that come up once you've hit the truncal clone. We know that resistance is fundamentally driven by the tumour heterogeneity that I showed you on the previous slide. We also know that as the cancer evolves along that, there is co-evolution of the immune system and the immune evasion that happens. And if we can understand that and help to overcome that evasion of the immune system, again, we can improve long-term survival outcomes. The other piece that we're working on is that many of the targets that we know are fundamentally important in the evolution of cancer and quite early and truncal events have to some degree been undruggable. And we're chipping away at the undruggable genome and making more and more of those targets now targetable. We also know that if we understand the clones that will emerge under the selection pressure of a particular therapy, we can design better combination treatments. So this is the fundamental thinking about our strategy for how we're developing treatments. Next slide, please. So what you can see here on this slide, on the left-hand side, first of all, is that even for cancers like lung cancer, which are at that lower end of the 5-year survival benefit, if we diagnose them early, a much higher proportion of patients can be expected to survive. Oops, we seem to have lost the slides. Hopefully we can get back to the slides quickly. But what I was saying is, even with a lung cancer, if you diagnose it earlier, although early stage lung cancer, we don't do as well as we do with early stage breast cancer, still fundamentally we do far, far better than we do if it's diagnosed in stage 4. But unfortunately, at the moment, 40% of patients with lung cancer are diagnosed at the metastatic stage. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there are drugs now that are coming, which if we can apply in the earlier stages will make a difference. So these are data taken with a PD-L1 immune checkpoint inhibitor called durvalumab from the Pacific study, which was taking patients with unresectable stage 3 non-small cell lung cancer. So this is still locally advanced disease, it isn't early stage disease, but what you see here is a substantial improvement in the overall survival. And we think if we take it into even earlier stages, we can make a bigger difference. Next slide. So the other thing that we need in order to detect more patients with cancer is changes in the technology for doing that. And we're starting to see that with the evolution of technologies such as circulating tumour DNA testing. The GRAIL test is one form of this, and it's quite exciting because as well as detecting circulating tumour DNA, it also detects the methylation patterns in those tumour DNA, and so you can detect not just the fact that you might have cancer, but also get some information about the potential tissue of origin, I think, which is incredibly important. So if you can take a blood test like this and screen a population, you might then be able to substantially make this shift between the 55% of patients that are currently diagnosed in early stage 1 and 2, and increase that to the target of 75%, which is what you've heard about. Next slide. So I was very excited to hear the collaboration between GRAIL and the NHS, and these are some of the details about what the GRAIL study is looking at. It's going to take 140,000 participants aged between 50 and 77 who have a 50% elevated risk of cancer, and randomise them either just to take blood and store it, or to take blood and then actually read the test, and if a signal is detected they will be put into the urgent referral network for the detection of cancer. I think this can have, not only a fundamental shift in the diagnosis of patients early, but also creates, from an industry perspective, an opportunity to think about novel clinical trial designs for the patients that have been picked up in that early stage. At the moment, unlike cancers like lung cancer, where there have been screening trials published, there are other cancers like pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, which don't have routine screening tests at the moment. If we can pick those up and we can diagnose those earlier, there are new spaces we can create where we can look at clinical trials and potentially test drugs in that setting. Now, the other thing you've got to think about is what's the characteristics of the drug that you would want to put into these early stages. You typically want to have drugs that have got a good safety profile when you're going into the earlier stages of disease. Drugs like durvalumab probably fit that characteristic. It's already been investigated in adjuvant settings. So any drug that's good enough for the adjuvant setting of treatment of cancer, I think would be suitable for this kind of setting. But you can start to think about other tumour types beyond lung cancer. Next slide. The other thing you've got to think about is, what would you do as a follow-up test? These are data that have been kindly shared by Charlie Swanton from the TracerX data. And again, at the time when you can pick up circulating tumour DNA with the Gallery GRAIL test or with the other technologies that currently exist, the chances are that you're going to have a variant allele fraction for your circulating tumour DNA of around 0.1%. And that translates through on imaging data into a predictive volume of about 11 cubic centimetres, or a maximum diameter of about 2.8 centimetres. So this should be well in the range of size that you can pick up on routine imaging and CT scans. So in fact, the types of trials that you then might need to think about are potentially window of opportunity trials or the neoadjuvant setting. Go on to the next slide. And the good news is that we already know that drugs like the immune checkpoint inhibitors, in combination with chemotherapy in non-small cell lung cancer in this case, are showing exciting activity in the neoadjuvant setting. So this trial shows on the left-hand side of the pathologic complete response rate in the neoadjuvant setting for different immune checkpoint inhibitors, either in combination with chemotherapy in green or as monotherapy in yellow. And on the right-hand side is a different endpoint, the major pathologic response. And I think this brings up another point, which is if we're going to run these trials in these settings, once we've detected patients early, we're going to need to think about the validation of endpoints like pathologic complete response as a potential predictor of longer term outcome like progression-free survival and overall survival. And again, we've made progress in this regard in breast cancer, but I think there's multiple other tumour types where we need to think about these endpoints and how they might translate through to survival benefit. Next slide. So another setting that I think will increase is the setting of kind of the post-adjuvant treatment. At the moment, when we're designing adjuvant trials, they tend to be very large, very long, and you're detecting relatively small changes in the absolute benefit in those adjuvant settings. If you're then going to add a new treatment to that, that's often very challenging, and that's been shown with a lot of the debate in the breast cancer setting. So one way to address that is to take those patients that have had standard adjuvant therapy, whether that's surgery or surgery plus chemotherapy, for example, and look at those patients who haven't had a complete elimination of their disease, and they have minimal residual disease, I think is the definition. So the trials that we talked about here are Mermaid, named after MRD or minimal residual disease, where you might take patients following surgery and look for residual circulating tumour DNA on a blood test. Now, again, the challenge that you've got here is that the limit of detection of standard technology circulating tumour DNA that's typically used in the metastatic setting isn't sensitive enough to really be useful in this setting. So we're having to collaborate and look at novel technology in this space. And in this case, the Mermaid studies that we're running, up and running now, are in collaboration with a company called Archer that can do personalised circulating tumour DNA testing. So this trial, Mermaid-1, is screening over 2,000 patients who have surgery, and then 4 to 5 weeks post-operatively, they'll have 2 blood samples taken to see if minimal residual disease can be detected, and then randomised to either in the MRD positive or MRD negative to chemotherapy plus placebo or chemotherapy plus durvalumab. So Mermaid-1 does it as a landmark measurement in that 4 to 5 week time period after surgery. Mermaid-2 looks over a longer time frame, longitudinally, about the emergence of circulating tumour DNA over a 2-year period following adjuvant therapy. Next slide. And when you're looking at the technology that needs to be applied, again, there's some really nice data that has been published with Christa Bosch and Charlie Swanson's group from the CRIC, where they looked at actually what you need to do is think about how many mutations you're actually going to detect in the blood. If you were just looking at a single mutation for a driver gene, such as EGFR, for example, in lung cancer, you would need to take a large volume of blood in order to have the chance of detecting that with the limit of detection. And again, it comes down to actually how many mutant copies of DNA exist in that blood sample. And so you probably need to look for something more like 50 different mutations. And so you need to look just beyond the drivers to passenger mutations in the blood. What that means is you need to look at the individual patient's cancer and look at what mutations exist in that patient's cancer. So that means a 2-step process, which is more complicated. So the first is whole exome sequencing, and then an algorithm to identify the clonal mutations in the tumour, prioritising the low noise variants for subsequent tracking. And then an individualised panel is designed, which can then be detected in the plasma using plasma ctDNA analysis. So again, this is really pushing the boundaries of the technology in terms of what's possible with circulating tumour DNA. But I do think those kinds of trial designs are very exciting, because actually, as you can see, rather than treating thousands of patients in the adjuvant setting, you're actually ending up randomising 200 or 300 patients to try and see the effect size that you're looking for. Next slide. The other utility for circulating tumour DNA, once you have diagnosed patients, is potentially to look at adapting therapy as you're going along. So typically at the moment we wait until patients progress by imaging, but in fact several studies have shown that you can see the emergence of resistant clones at a much earlier point if you track them with the circulating tumour DNA. And this creates another trial design opportunity, if you like, where you might be able to detect early and then switch to a different therapy or add on a different therapy. And again, this is a fundamental part of the approach and change that we're now implementing into clinical trials at AstraZeneca. So I think if you put all of these together, I think it's a very exciting time in the potential of treatment of cancer, where we can marry together the technology, the new range of drugs that are coming through, and create new treatment regimens, really, building on the opportunity of the early detection. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have later. I think I'm handing over to Peter Johnson now. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for that fascinating talk. Just a reminder to the audience that if you have questions for Susan, or indeed myself or Peter, please do submit them through the Q&A function that you can find with the kind of question mark speech bubble icon. Now, yes, I'm very honoured to introduce Professor Peter Johnson, the National Clinical Director for the NHS England Cancer Programme. Peter, over to you, please.
David, thank you very much indeed. Very good to be with you this morning, and thank you for the invitation to join in the launch for the roadmap, which I think is a fantastic development and really sets out for us some of the ambitions and some of the areas where we need to pursue progress in early cancer detection and diagnosis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see this fitting into cancer services in general and what we're hoping to achieve by pursuing it. Next slide, please. So what I've set out on this slide is 3 of the problems that we have with early detection and diagnosis, and something also indicating that we may be making progress. The top left-hand corner is a representation of two people, one of whom has cancer and one of whom doesn't. And what you can see is a mass of complex information with one tiny difference between the two. And this really typifies the problem we have with early cancer detection, which is, of course, that very many are entirely asymptomatic during the point at which they are growing and developing and potentially spreading within the body. And finding these tiny differences on a background of confusing information has been something which we've really struggled with previously. So the asymptomatic population and the need to find better methods of screening is one thing. Of course, the other thing is the symptomatic population and making sure that we facilitate as far as possible people's way into the healthcare system so that they don't do what the British have traditionally tended to do, which is keep themselves to themselves and not go and seek help if they have symptoms. So lowering the barriers to getting into primary care, lowering the barriers to onward referral. And the bottom left panel here shows what we've been doing with our early diagnosis referral system. And what you can see here are three lines. The bottom line in green, which you might miss if you weren't looking carefully, is the number of people actually being diagnosed with cancer as a result of a 2-week wait referral. And you can see that it's very slowly increasing between 2009 and 2016 when this data was cut off. The dark blue line is the number of people that have been referred into the system on an urgent 2-week wait. And you can see this has been rising extremely sharply. And in fact, it's been rising sharply ever since. And at the moment, we are seeing around 2.4 million people a year referred with potential urgent cancer symptoms, but only between 6 and 7% of those actually have cancer. So we're spending an enormous amount of effort and putting people through an enormous amount of testing in order not to diagnose cancer in 93% of cases. And the consequence of that is what you can see on the pink line on that graph, which is our ability to get a diagnosis and start treatment within 62 days of an urgent referral, which started to decline quite sharply in 2013 as we started to hit the capacity, the diagnostic capacity particularly, of the NHS as we switched on these very large numbers of urgent referrals. And you can see that that's gone down and we are continuing to struggle to hit the targets even before the coronavirus for rapid diagnosis. So we've pressured the healthcare system very substantially for good reasons, and there's no doubt that we have increased the number of people diagnosed through this route, as I'll show, but it's at considerable cost in terms of the ability of the system to cope. And if we look at the top right here, this is the number of the proportion of people with different cancer types. It's hard to read clearly, but essentially it's bladder cancer and breast cancer at the top. The proportion who are diagnosed at stage 1 or 2, so when the cancer is confined to the local tissues before it's spread to the regional lymph nodes. And this goes between 2012 and 2017. And what you can see is that the great majority of these lines are not really moving very much. There's a few notable exceptions where we have done better at diagnosing people sooner. There are 1 or 2 instances where the number has actually fallen over time. But in general terms, there is a slow but steady increase in the proportion of people that we diagnose at stage 1, 2, which is currently at about 54% if we aggregate all the cancers that we see. So we are still struggling to move this line upwards, and clearly we need to have a major shift in order to change that. The bottom right here is my cause for some optimism, which is the routes to presentation updated to 2017 of people with cancer. And what we can see is that the green line at the top is the proportion of people with cancer who come through the 2-week wait urgent referral system, which is now at about 40% of cases, and a corresponding fall in the proportion of people who present to the system as emergencies, which is the red line, which is progressively declining. And that's important because we know that people who present through A&E or through urgent referrals in this way have a much less good prognosis. So we are making headway, but it is a slow business. Next slide, please. And this really sets out the challenges as we see it in terms of wanting to make inroads into early diagnosis of cancer. What you have along the vertical axis here is the incidence rate of cancers, the numbers diagnosed per year, and you can see at the top there breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, the big 4. And along the horizontal axis is the proportion of cases that we diagnose in the UK that are at stage 1, 2 at the time of diagnosis. So we do very well with breast cancer and melanoma, high rates of early diagnosis, but correspondingly you can see we do much less well with lung cancer, esophageal cancer, pancreatic cancer, and so on. And so the challenge for us here is to move all these dots to the right to increase the proportion, and in particular, of course, to move the ones which are most prevalent. And you can see also in the middle of this diagram there's a dot labelled other, which is a collection of less common cancers, and you can see that in aggregate that's a large number, that's over 30,000 cases. And again, this exemplifies the fact that we need ways of picking up not just the common cancers, for which some of which we have screening programs, but for a whole raft of other potential cancers as well. And again, this is the challenge for colleagues in primary care, is to be able to identify these. Next slide, please. If we look at the regional variation in the stage at diagnosis, this is a map produced by Cancer Research UK a few years ago, showing the difference between, in red, the areas with the most common late diagnosis, where more than 50% of people presented at stage 3, 4, and in blue, where those figures are somewhat lower, down in the mid 40%. And you can see very easily that these map clearly to areas of relative socioeconomic deprivation. And we know from looking at the data that there are differences according to gender, with men more likely to be diagnosed at a later stage. By age, the elderly are much more likely to be diagnosed with advanced cancer, those in more deprived areas, and people particularly from Black backgrounds have higher rates of a late stage diagnosis. And so all of these things are areas where we need to press, and in thinking about how we gear early detection and diagnosis programs, we need to think about not just how we do it, but how we target it at the populations who are least well served by our current interventions. And of course, these are the populations who find it hardest to access healthcare in a variety of settings. Next slide, please. So in thinking about what might allow us to shift towards earlier diagnosis, this is a helpful waterfall produced again by CI UK, and as you can see, what we're trying to do is to increase the rate of early diagnosis from the current of 54% at the top left down to something more like 75%. And there's a variety of incremental changes that we can potentially make to what we're doing in order to try and achieve this. We can optimize our screening programs, particularly existing, such as bowel cancer screening, which is highly effective, and which we're hoping to extend the age downwards in order to catch people earlier. We've had our targeted lung cancer screening, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and a variety of other screening optimization moves that we can make to increase our rates of early pickup. In addition to this, if we can get the referrals in at the rate envisaged by the NICE guidance, so-called NG12 guidance, at the rates that are anticipated by that, we think that we'll increase the pickup rate by a significant amount. But as we get down to the bottom right here, what we're increasingly depending on is new technologies to help us. The purple bar in the middle is really about public information and making sure that those people who do have early symptoms, weight loss, lumps, unexplained pains, loss of blood, do present early. And we still think there's major headroom, and again, the map that I just showed you shows that if we got the areas of the country who are least likely to present to their GP up to the areas where people are most likely to present, we would make a very substantial shift. So this is not just about technology, this is about public attitudes, this is about convincing people that if you get cancer diagnosed early, something can be done about it. This is not something to be frightened of or to keep quiet about. This is very much something to bring people to the attention of healthcare, and for us to remove those barriers. But as I say, the bottom right is heavily dependent on changes in technology and the application of the kind of techniques that Susan's already mentioned. Next slide, please. So in setting out the long-term ambitions for the NHS, we have two dominant priorities for the cancer programme, which we hope to achieve by the end of this decade. The first of this is to make sure that an extra 55,000 people every year are surviving more than 5 years from the time of their diagnosis. And if you look at the maths of that and what's most likely to move the dial, that is going to be very heavily dependent upon diagnosing cancers at an early stage in much greater numbers. And we've set out the ambition to move from our current 54% to 75% before the end of this decade. Next slide, please. So in terms of the delivery of this long-term plan, we have a number of headline items that we are pursuing energetically, and those are listed here. To deliver the most comprehensive screening and early detection program in the world, and I'll talk a little bit more about lung health checks in a second, to make sure that we're providing equitable and rapid access to diagnostic tests and results, and again I'll talk a little bit more about the rapid diagnosis centres, obviously to make sure that when we do have the diagnosis, patients get rapid treatment, the most precise treatment, the most up-to-date, to make sure we deliver personalised care in the way that people want us to do it, and to make sure that we rationalise the way that we follow people up, to make sure that we are making the best possible use of, for example, our secondary care. And finally, and very importantly in the context of the roadmap, to make sure that we're harnessing the in collective endeavours not only of the healthcare system, but of course academia and industry partners, to make sure that we are all joined up as much as possible in these endeavours. Next slide, please. So looking at the targeted lung health checks, this is a program which we started rolling out last year. It's been a little blown off course by the coronavirus, but is now back up and running again. And essentially this is to pilot the idea of CT screening for lung cancer, offering people lung health checks, and for those who meet the appropriate risk level, offering them an immediate CT scan. We started out with 10 pilot sites across England and have now incorporated some of the previously existing programs in places like Manchester, Liverpool. So we'll have 14 or 15 programs across the country in the areas with the highest rates of lung cancer. And again, going back to that map, very important that we're targeting the pink areas on that map to make sure that we're taking the tests to the people. And we will be inviting people between the ages of 55 and 75 who've smoked to come and have the lung health check and to have a CT scan there and then, with the scanners in community settings. And again, very importantly, lowering the barriers to presentation, taking the test to people. And we anticipate diagnosing around 5,000 lung cancers over the next 3 years or so. And what we clearly need to see is whether this results in a stage shift in lung cancer. And if it does, we plan to roll this out as a national programme as rapidly as possible thereafter. So we're piloting it to make sure we can deliver it, to make sure it will work, to make sure we can get the scans done, but thereafter, if we're successful, we will roll that out. And linked to that, as Fergus may talk about in a bit, there's a number of research programs piggybacking on that program. There's the radiomics, the AI assessment of the scans, and also a program that I'm leading in my academic capacity, looking at bloodborne and tissue biomarkers to see if we can add value, if we can increase the precision of the process by looking for things like circulating autoantibodies, circulating DNA, or looking for transcriptional changes in the respiratory epithelium as part of this. So we will gain a lot of information over the next few years, not only about the efficacy of CT scans, but a variety of conjoined biomarkers as well. And we're launching those programs as the CT program is getting going. Next slide, please. Of course, the other important thing, as I've already said, is to make sure that we're lowering the barriers to presentation for people with symptoms as much as possible. And the programme of rapid diagnostic centres, which NHS England has been rolling out, is really aimed at doing precisely that. It's to try and make sure that we have maximise the efficiency of the diagnostic process, minimise the complicated diagnostic pathways that some people have to follow, particularly if they have symptoms which are less specific, vague abdominal pain, weight loss or whatever, to try and make sure that we streamline and turn as much into a one-stop process as we can. And so we have a number of pathways being set up. All the cancer alliances across England have at least one rapid diagnostic centre in making. Some of these are physical facilities, as in London in particular, and some other places. Others are virtual networks of linked up investigative processes to try and streamline this as far as possible. And you will have heard talk from Mike Richards' review of diagnostics of the idea that we are going to start piloting the idea of community diagnostic hubs, again taking the tests and taking the facilities to people. So these will be physical facilities which we hope as we get them stood up over the next few years will greatly add to the diagnostic capacity of the NHS, because as I've said before, this is a very capacity constrained system at the moment, and we need to make it easy, and we need to have the capacity to get people scanned, to get people biopsied. So at the moment this will be run through GP referrals, but the ambition in the longer term is to see whether we can actually make the system permissive enough and effective enough that we can start to think about people self-referring to the system if they have suspicious symptoms. And so this is a system which is coming together and developing very rapidly. It's being developed in a variety of different ways in different locations around England, and it'll be very interesting to see which of those models is most effective. And again, we're running a careful evaluation program to make sure that we're capturing all the information about how this works and where it works well. Next slide, please. And the final thing, and to come back to the collaboration and the roadmap as a general subject, of course, is the collaboration that we've already spoken about. And Susan has already mentioned the GRAIL pilot programme, which NHSE and GRAIL are partnering on. And we're very excited by this, because this is really very much a first for the NHS in England. And indeed, I think it's going to be a first for GRAIL as well. The idea that we can look at the DNA methylation patterns in asymptomatic individuals, and that the pattern of methylation will tell us not only potentially that there's an early tumour developing, but will give us an indication as to its site. So we know that the methylation patterns are different in esophageal or colorectal or head and neck cancers. And hopefully by doing this, we will be able to show whether or not testing people on an annual basis for 3 years will actually move the dial. And certainly the modelling is very exciting. The specificity of the test in the studies that have been done so far looks very high. These have all been carried out in people already diagnosed with cancer, where the company have looked at the methylation patterns in plasma. So that tells you something about people with a pre-existing diagnosis. And as I say, the specificity looks high, the false positive rate looks extremely low. What we of course need to show in the real life setting is what the sensitivity is like and whether this really can move the dial. The modelling suggests that it may give us 10 to 15 additional percentage points on early diagnosis rates, but it's very important that we do a properly designed study with controls to really demonstrate this in real life. Next slide, please. So I think to conclude, we have many good reasons to make progress in this area. And from the time when I was at Cancer Research UK there until now in my current post, we've really shifted the attention of a huge amount of cancer research from devising complex treatments for late stage disease to emphasising much more the front end of the pathway and how we can make progress in this area. And of course, the human and ethical reasons for doing this are absolutely overwhelming anyway, because this will help us to improve cure rates. But there is also as well the economic incentive, and the figures on the left here, again from some studies by CIUK a few years ago now, set out the relative costs of treating lung cancer or bowel cancer at stage 1 as opposed to the cost of treating people with advanced disease, who of course have prolonged courses of illness, a lot of interventions, a lot of requirement for palliative and supportive care, which in the case of lung cancer more or less doubles the cost, and in the case of colorectal cancer more or less quadruples the cost of care. So quite apart from wishing to save lives, we will also in the long run save money in the NHS if we can make this a more effective system. And finally, on the right hand side here, I think this is the important thing we have to keep coming back to. This shows you the incidence of cancer over time between 1995 and 2018, and we can see that there's a steady rise in cancer cases over that time as a result of the decline of competing risks in our ageing population. Gratifyingly, this is diverging from the number of people dying from cancer during this period, and that's the orange line at the bottom. And clearly the degree of divergence is a reflection of improving survival. And this is, of course, what we need to keep driving at, and which is the principal motivator of the work that we're doing and the reason for being of the roadmap. So I think there is grounds for optimism. We can see that those curves are diverging already, but we have an enormous amount more in order to make them diverge faster. So I will stop there and we will go into the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for that fantastic talk. And yeah, to remind participants, please do carry on submitting and voting for your favourite questions that we'll put to our panel. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel members that will now be joining Peter and Susan to field your questions. Very pleased to say we have joining us Professor Caroline Dive, who's the Deputy Director of the Cancer Research UK Manchester Institute and the leader of a large biomarker programme there. We're also honoured to be joined by Prof Fergus Gleeson from Oxford, who's the Chief Medical Officer of the National Consortium of Intelligent Medical Imaging and a consultant radiologist. And last but by no means least, we have Dr. Jodie Moffat joining us, who's the Head of Early Diagnosis from Cancer Research UK's Policy Division. So welcome, Fergus, Caroline and Jodie. So moving into the question and answers then, we've had a series of questions that were submitted by participants before the event, and I'll chuck a few of those out now, and then we'll start moving on to the live questions. Perhaps if I can begin with Caroline. So we've heard the importance of patients and public engagement, you know, from the patient talk at the start, but throughout the session. And the roadmap obviously includes the vision that early cancer technologies must be acceptable by members of the public. Caroline, how do you think that's going to be achieved?
Yeah, well, it's a real privilege to join you this morning, and I've actually had the pleasure really and a huge interest of talking about the development of this roadmap over, I think, a couple of years now and many meetings. And I guess the first thing I wanted to say is, you know, we start off with a really complicated challenge, and I think we can talk about it all the time and never get past chapter 1. And I think one of the things I'm so excited about with the development of the roadmap is we've actually got past just discussing the problem, and we've got past chapter 1. And we're now in chapter 2, where there is a roadmap. It's quite a long document, 75 pages, but it's not a difficult read, and it does have action points. I love action points, you know, and I think the challenge has been to pick off bite-sized chunks of the problem, but at the same time, keep the holistic picture, which is complicated, in view. And so to answer to your question, it's been a pleasure to be involved in the development of the roadmap, but I think whatever we do in the future for early detection of cancer, it has to be a minimal impact on people's daily lives. So what I'd like to see in the future is that something that can be built into a regular day. So you go shopping, you buy your can of baked beans in Tesco's, and you perhaps pop into the pharmacy in Tesco's and you give in your blood sample for your cancer screen. Now that sounds a bit in the future, and I think it is, with all of the challenges that we've been discussing this morning already. But I think whatever we end up with, it needs to be able to plug into the NHS and the diagnostic pathways and the referrals, as Peter mentioned. We have to be able to test and then have a treatment, as Susan mentioned, but it also has to be something that's going to be acceptable to the public, and they have to understand risk better. We have to be better at explaining the science in general, and I think perhaps just get something that becomes a routine. 1 in 2 of us are going to get cancer. We all know how devastating this disease is for families, but let's just do something in the end that minimises daily life, but keeps in mind this challenge. And we can pop perhaps and do something normal like shopping and hand in our blood sample for our test, as one example of perhaps what the future may hold.
That's great. Thank you, Caroline. No, I think we can all agree that kind of lowering the barriers for entry and participation is going to be crucial in cracking the problem and ensuring equity. Perhaps if I can introduce Fergus now. Fergus, we've heard a lot in these talks and you know in the media and whatnot generally about the potential for liquid biopsy for changing the way we detect cancers, but of course that won't be the only technology or perhaps the answer to the entire problem. Would you like to comment on, you know, the role you see imaging playing and how those different technologies might interrelate?
Thanks David, and thank you for asking me. It's a great privilege. I think it's a field change that's going to make things both better but harder, because we're going to be asked to be looking for smaller lumps. I remember about 20 years ago, I took my elder daughter to work with me, and she said, "You're just looking for dots, Dad, aren't you? That's you've been to college and that's your job, and now you're going to make the dots smaller." So it is going to be harder, but it's better because you're going to tell me where to look. And actually having a whole body CT or whole body MR is difficult to interpret. So I think if we can get pointers to where to look, that's better. And as Peter has mentioned, we're now in the era of artificial intelligence coming into play, and actually no one would now do lung cancer screening without some form of AI nodule detection model. So I think we can span that out for whole body DWI, etc. So I think it's better, harder, but there's a greater future as well.
Thank you, Fergus. Yeah, I think what certainly the roadmap tries to lay out is this vision for integration of technologies, and that sometimes
may
that
I
would be...
just sorry to interrupt. May I add a plug to Peter mentioned with the lung health check programs that he's running in Southampton, and we're going to run across a number of the centres whereby we're going to take the CT screening data and use AI to detect the nodules and combine that with liquid biopsies to see if we can, when we detect a dot, see if it is more likely to be cancer. And actually, not only do I think we will be able to detect cancers earlier, I think there are going to be things such as less tissue biopsies before you have your lung cancer resection. Because if you can have your liquid biopsy and do your AI interpretation of your CT, you'll be up in the 90+% likelihood of it being a tumour. And why would you have a biopsy whether the predictive value of a biopsy is around about 90% but has complications? So just a plug for Peter's programme and DART, which are part funded by CRUK. So just should
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I think that's exactly the vision, right? Is that through the integration of technologies we can get, and that could be genuine integration of the data or a sequential kind of cascade of tests, but we can get to a much greater point of sensitivity and specificity and certainty about prognosis that works for the health system but works for the individual and cuts down that uncertainty and anxiety that could otherwise arise. If I can introduce Jodie now. Jodie, we've talked in the talks and in the roadmap itself about the importance of engaging policymakers and NHS decision makers, and of course we have one on our panel right now. But how do we go about engaging those decision makers in the system to ensure that we prosecute the recommendations of the roadmap, but that we affect meaningful change?
Good morning. It's a really important question. As you mentioned, there are a number of policy recommendations, and Cancer Research UK has been very actively working in the area of early diagnosis for over a decade now, and through that time has built very strong networks with policymakers and key opinion leaders across all parts of the UK, which has been really valuable for ensuring that we get early diagnosis and detection onto the radar and into things like we've heard about today, the long-term plan ambition to see 75% diagnosed at stage 1 and 2. And there are opportunities to do that very currently with cancer strategies across nations, including in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And so that's what CRUK has done and will continue to do. I think some of the policy recommendations in the roadmap, because of how strong it is on addressing some of the challenges that we've seen in the science and the research, will mean that CRUK needs to engage more widely and a bit differently than we have in some of those areas to ensure that we can address things like the market failure that has been spoken about. But it's been a huge asset that we've had policymakers involved in the very development of this roadmap, and that it isn't just CRUK, it is a wider community agenda, and we'll be looking to them and working closely with them to take this forward over the coming months and years.
Thank you, Jodie. Yeah, I completely agree. So perhaps if we move over to some of the live questions that are coming through from the audience now, a couple of the most upvoted questions concern really engagement with the public on early detection, and how do we incentivize people to take more ownership of their own well-being, modifiable risk factors, but also taking up the early diagnosis opportunities that exist. And another related question talking about the potential for the kind of solutions that Caroline mentioned. So early detection in real life in the community, be that through pharmacies or other kind of community settings. Perhaps if I could invite Peter to comment on those issues.
Thank you, David. During the time I was at Cancer Research UK, easily the most contentious and difficult subject that ever came up in the press was screening programs. And they divide opinion very sharply. We as cancer specialists, as biologists, are terrifically excited about the idea of doing tests and finding cancer earlier, and we can all readily see the benefits and the advantages of doing that. There is a whole lot of people out there who don't fancy that at all. They're worried about the false positives that we will pick up because no test is 100% specific, and they're worried about us subjecting people to anxiety and tests and things for which when they don't have cancer. Now, as I've already said, we are already inviting millions of people a year to come and see people in hospitals with possible cancer symptoms. And there is no doubt that generates a significant amount of anxiety. Anybody who's seen patients in a 2-week wait clinic, and I do that every week, knows how anxious people are when they get the letter through saying, you've been referred for an urgent possible cancer diagnosis, you need to go and see somebody. So we have to be cognizant of that and recognize that whilst we're incredibly enthusiastic about driving the numbers up, we need to make clear to people that this is something which shouldn't be perceived as a huge threat. And that's why very often in the public messaging, we usually say it's probably nothing but. Very important to have people on board and to make sure we bring the constituency together. And somebody in the questions has made the point about the skepticism of coronavirus vaccination, for example. We need to make clear that what we're doing is trying to normalize the early examination to exclude cancer, and that we're doing this because we think it will be helpful, and because, of course, if you catch it at an early stage, this is something which is readily curable, readily removable. But there's an enormous burden on us to make sure that that's part of public discourse, and it's not something which we don't openly talk about and which is somehow abnormal. And that's going to take us a while to persuade people of that. And we really just have to keep explaining the pros and cons of this, and people will get it. But I think we probably need to do more to pursue that. And you only have to look at the debate that continues about breast screening, which demonstrably does reduce the number of women dying of breast cancer, to see that is still a highly contentious subject many years after we introduce screening programs. So we have to tread carefully, and we have to recognize that nobody has a monopoly of truth in this area.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's crucially important. There's a couple of waves of hands from the panel I can see, so if I could bring in Susan perhaps at this point.
Yeah, so I think in addition to all of the communication, which I completely agree with, I think the other thing that can help address the anxiety and the fear is by having better treatments that are less toxic or less morbidity associated with them. So, I am excited about the opportunity to reduce the morbidity of surgery, for example. We've done that in breast cancer settings, right, where over a period of time, we've increased the proportion of patients that can have neoadjuvant treatment and remove the proportion that end up having mastectomy. I think there are other settings where you can apply the same principles. It does take time to bring that through. In addition, I think in terms of the kinds of treatments that we can bring in, I think there are, some of the more novel treatments do have a better tolerability profile than classic cytotoxic chemotherapy. So I think there are ways in which over time we can help to address that level of anxiety. Normalization is one element of it. Reduction in the toxicity burden when you are treated is another really important component of it.
Yeah, I think it's obviously nobody would argue against the importance of really understanding what the public will accept and using that to inform research in this space. And certainly the roadmap makes a couple of recommendations about how we can start to go about that. If I can move on to another topic, we have talked about the importance of both industry and academia in this space, and of course there's huge scope for collaboration there, and the roadmap very much emphasises that. Perhaps if I can ask Susan to comment on, we've had a couple of questions in the live questions and also the pre-submitted ones about how is industry feeling in this space now. Obviously you can comment on your own company, but perhaps if you can give us a sense of the pharma industry more broadly. Is the model changing as early detection approaches come online? is there a new way of doing science in this space, and what importance does industry ascribe to interaction with academia?
Well, on the last point, you know, we move forward through collaboration. I think the science is an inherently collaborative process, and I think there are great examples of where we've been able to move faster through these kinds of collaborations. In fact, one of the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has been, you know, the progress that you can make at speed through collaboration between, you know, governments, industry, charities, and academic sectors working all together. So I think it's incredibly important. The first point. Secondly, in terms of the approach to, you know, early treatment of cancer, I think it is the route to better long-term outcomes. And in terms of you know, getting reimbursement for therapies, if you can show efficacy in the early settings, you're much more likely to show a benefit risk ratio and an appropriate cost effectiveness ratio in that setting. The challenge has always been, how early in drug development can you start? And I think really the opportunity for window of opportunity studies and neoadjuvant settings is a great place actually to understand what you're doing in that setting. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity. In the neoadjuvant setting, you often get a biopsy before treatment and a biopsy or the excision of tumour after treatment. It's a place where you can see the impact that a novel therapy is having and use that to make decisions. So I think we're starting to see that embedded much earlier in development. One recent example is we have a novel oral SERD, selective estrogen receptor downregulator. Now, targeting the estrogen receptor is well clinically validated in the treatment of ER-positive breast cancer. And what we've done with the phase 1 development of that program is think about how we might go into window of opportunity actually before we started the phase 3 in the metastatic setting. So that's an example of, you know, embedding some of these trial designs into the earlier phases of development, so hopefully we can get into the earlier settings for an approved treatment at an earlier point in the drug's development. And there are many other examples that we can look at across the portfolio. So I do think this is an approach and an area that is being embraced by industry, but it's being enabled by some of the technology improvements that we've talked about as well. And I think they go hand in hand. And I think collaboration is key to enabling it even faster pace than we can currently do.
Thank you, Susan. So for the next question, it's one of the more upvoted ones we've had, and I think Jodie, I'll throw this one to you first, but I'd be interested in responses across the panel. So if anyone wants to take a swing at it, do wave your hand at me. Should more lethal cancers be prioritised for early detection and diagnosis approaches to maximise limited resources? Now, I mean, that's a really interesting question that probably moves beyond the bounds of biology and medicine into moral philosophy, and it kind of depends on how you define utility. You know, greatest benefit to the most number, should you be going after high incidence cancers, or greatest benefit to the individual and go after the more lethal ones, as this questioner suggests. So Jodie, do you want to first go at that and then we'll throw it open?
Okay, so I have a few different thoughts come to mind. I think, as you've mentioned, Dave, one of the key themes within the roadmap is the area of biology and prognosis, and there are gaps in our understanding there that we need to be addressing, and this roadmap is sending a really clear signal that that is going to be really important, so that we can help to ensure that we're reducing the chances of overdiagnosis and overtreatment, and directing the resource that we have into areas of most need, and reducing unnecessary anxiety for people who perhaps needn't have worried. So that is a really important theme of the roadmap that does need sorting. I think in terms of your question as well, the broader kind of morals of it, I think it's come up quite a lot recently, actually, as we're thinking about the COVID recovery and where we have a significant backlog of patients and lots of interest in understanding how we might use risk assessment approaches to help prioritise those who are on the waiting list. And I guess from a Cancer Research UK point of view, how we manage that between ensuring that we're finding those people who are more likely to have cancer, but also making sure that we're not actually, in doing so, missing those people who have early stage disease, because of, and that will be a really important consideration. I think just generally, we absolutely appreciate the challenge within the health service in terms of capacity. It's a long-standing issue, as Peter has mentioned previously, with some of the challenges in delivering the 62-day target, for example, even before COVID hit. And we need to ensure as far as possible that what we deliver in terms of services for cancer patients are based on the science and on the evidence and what's right to do, and have less to do with what we can actually deliver by way of service capacity. It's absolutely vital that we see longer term investment in the workforce and the kit to deliver what we need now, and to deliver on these, hopefully very exciting and hugely impactful developments of the future.
Thank you, Jodie. Perhaps could I bring in Fergus in on this one as a practicing clinician? Building on Jodie's points there, where do you see the greatest need for prioritization around early detection? Should we be targeting the more lethal cancers?
So first of all, I'm glad I would never have to make that kind of decision. I think those things are. I'm glad people like Peter put their hands up and have those roles. From my perspective, I think the most important thing is that we improve access, and we make if we just talk imaging, we standardize imaging access, and we improve image reporting and feedback. And I was on a call across the Thames Valley related to our lung cancer pathway. And even within the Thames Valley, we don't all do it the same way. We don't all do it at the same speed. And if we can get rid of those, they're not inequalities, they're just different ways of doing things, and standardize it, I think that will improve things hugely. And it'll remove a whole bunch of unnecessary steps. Patients, I remember when both my parents had cancer, and they kept on saying everything takes a minimum of 2 weeks. Everything, you have one thing, another thing's 2 weeks away at the earliest, another thing, and before you know it, you're 2 months down the line. So I think we need to, and if we can do that, maybe we can avoid some of the prioritization you're talking about. That's my plea.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's well heard. So we've talked a lot about the sort of clinical end of the spectrum and the need for patient engagement. One question that came through in various different forms in the pre-submitted questions is around the earlier part of the translational pathway. So perhaps if I can ask Caroline to comment on this one initially. What can we do to make sure that biomarkers progress along the pathway when the figure that the questioner quoted is less than 2% achieve clinical adoption, and I think less than is probably the relevant part of that. The roadmap makes some recommendations around supporting early discovery and translational research, but Caroline, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the valley of death for biomarker research is well known. Even in late stage disease, getting a biomarker through to routine use there is a challenge. Of course, it's even much more difficult in the early setting. And I think I want to make 2 points really. With Charlie Swanton, I run the Cancer Research UK Lung Cancer Centre of Excellence, and we did some of those early work with colleagues in Manchester, in North Manchester, in some very socially deprived areas. So one of the points I wanted to make was, encouraging those folks who would call them high risk, hard to reach, to participate in research and biomarker development has been an absolute privilege for me. I had the benefit of actually going out to the CT scanner vans in car parks in North Manchester and talking to the folks coming in. And first, I just want to say, they welcome research. And so I think one of those things is that you need an enormous amount of samples in early detection to develop a biomarker test, and to develop it in such a robust way that you try and minimize some of the concerns that have already been discussed this morning, and false positives, overdiagnosis, do no harm, etc. So I think the point that is difficult for early detection is having enough relevant clinical samples to develop your biomarker test. And I think, what I learned from sitting on those trucks and talking to the folks coming in who offered their blood samples for research is that they are very happy to do that. And I think marrying the private sector and the public sector to have the collection of samples that is big enough and funded enough to do the development of the biomarker test is a very good first accomplishment. Then validating your test and making sure it's fit for purpose, I think then becomes that little bit more easy. I think all of the things that Peter said about, you know, this vision, of course, that I have is in the future for where this becomes a routine thing for the public to do. There's a huge amount of work to get there. So I think, you know, it's getting the right clinical sample collections at the right scale for the development of the test, and to bring in all the experts that help you develop that test, private and public, clinical and non-clinical, technologists, have them all around the table having that discussion, so that you do the best biomarker development and testing and validation that you can possibly do. It doesn't answer your question directly, but I think it's a good, having those sample sets, having the right sample sets, having the right negative controls with all the multimorbidities that come in those high-risk cohorts. You know, they're not just at risk of getting cancer, they're at risk of other health problems as well. And having those right samples so that you can develop your test well is clearly the first thing that we have to get right.
Yeah, no, it's crucially important. It comes up time and time again. Obviously, it's highlighted by the roadmap as a key barrier, is that the lack of samples from the earliest stages of disease, but also perhaps equally as importantly from the kind of longitudinal sampling from pre-disease through early disease to established disease, and seeing that those changes.
I think the other thing to say, David, just to complete, is as we are now beginning to pick up more early stage lung cancers and the folks have surgery, that now generates the tissue to characterize the early disease. So there's a sort of a feedback loop there as the success mounts. And, whilst I don't want to be overly optimistic, which is something I tend to do, I do think we are making progress, and the more tissue you get that's early biology, the more you can study it, the more you can intelligently plan your biomarker program. So it is happening.
And capitalizing on the, existing opportunities is going to be absolutely crucial. So whether that's things like the lung health checks or the GRAIL program, if we can use those existing infrastructural investments and platforms to capture samples and feed those back into discovery and validation research, that could be really powerful. Peter,
we are very lucky.
So I was going to ask if Peter has any thoughts on that. What can the NHS and the existing infrastructure do to help sort of better support discovery and validation?
I think it's really important that we find every opportunity to link scientific inquiry into the big programs that are being rolled out. So as Fergus has already said, we're doing a lot with the lung health checks as we set up our rapid diagnostic clinics. As we build up the community diagnostic hubs, we should have an eye all the time on how that can link into the scientific inquiry, how we can make sure that we're asking people if we can use their samples for research, and generally speaking, 99% of people that you ask will say that's a fantastic idea, and most of them assume we're doing it anyway. So I think it is very important that we keep our eyes open for that. Now, clearly there are all sorts of complexities to doing that and making sure that we do it right, but there are enormous opportunities, and I think one of the important arguments for people who worry about us medicalizing the healthy population, if I can put it that way, is that it's actually a means of learning more about the early stages of illness and finding better and more secure ways to diagnose it in the future. And only by doing these kind of experiments and having these kind of partnerships will we drive down the false positive rate, and will we ultimately reduce the anxiety that we induce in healthy people. Unfortunately, there's an intermediate step that we have to get through, which is doing the experiments, doing the tests, and I foresee that, for example, the GRAIL test is only just the beginning, just the tip of the iceberg of the application of this kind of technology. We're going to see an enormous explosion of wearable technology, potentially implantable devices, although I realise that's a bit of a trigger word for a lot of people at the moment, but all sorts of different ways of sampling our biome, if you like, to work out how we can do this better in the future. And the NHS absolutely sees this as a fantastic opportunity for partnership with, as I say, academia and industry.
Yeah, that's really important points, Peter. I'm afraid we're out of time. That's been fascinating. Thank you so much to all of the panel for your insightful and really active participation in that discussion, and I hope that was fun for the audience and for yourselves. So to wrap things up, now this morning we've heard about the opportunities available for researchers across an array of disciplines. to collaborate with healthcare professionals, with industry, with policymakers to drive forward progress. And the roadmap, sets a vision for how those sectors need to collaborate. And really the path that the roadmap lays out, as we've repeatedly, I think, emphasised, the public sit at the heart of this journey, and a deeper understanding of the needs and perspective of patients and the public is a critical step to designing the next wave of technologies in this space. So I'd like to end our event by sharing with you Terry's story. Terry is a CRUK Cancer Insights panel patient representative, and he's going to share his insight into how early detection can really change lives. Just to note that the volume is quite low on this video, so you may need to turn it up a little. Thank you.
Hello everyone, how are you doing? My name is Terry Kavanagh and I'm a lung cancer patient, albeit a long-term survivor, something I don't mind being called really. Looking back to when I was diagnosed, all I had going for me was the fact that I presented early. Now I'm living proof that early detection works. I'm 75 next month. I was 42 when I was diagnosed. I had surgery to move off my left lung, and I'll never forget the surgeon's words after my operation. Well, Terry, he said, I'm satisfied because it's early. I was later referred to an oncologist for further treatment, but as it turned out, I didn't need any more therapy. The impact that early detection and diagnosis can have for patients can be phenomenal. Consider hospital stays, hospital visits, and a strain on families, not to mention getting back to work. So much of this can be avoided. Early detection and diagnosis can give patients their lives back. Early detection is a challenge, which will also speed up diagnostics and help identify cancers earlier, giving better outcomes for patients. We need a collaborative approach with a clear directive to push education and screening to the public, and to identify high-risk groups as populations for early detection research. We live in strange times, and I fear for the future of cancer treatments. I believe that more than ever, we need to find cancer early. People get scared and delay in presenting promptly. We need to overcome this fear. I believe we need some kind of task force to take this on and make the changes that are needed to make this happen. Patients and public involvement needs to spearhead the goal to take this forward. The patient's lived experience of cancer could play a vital role in helping reduce cancer mortality rates. We must involve the public in all stages of early detection and diagnostic research, and ensure all technologies and approaches have a clear line of sight to clinical and population impact. This has got to be the way ahead in catching cancer quickly and saving more lives before it spreads. We must send out a strong message of hope to the public that by presenting early, cancer can be beaten. I found myself echoing the surgeon's comments, because it's early, which is really why I'm still here. It's enabled me to see my children marry, have grandchildren come along, and I recently became a great-granddad. Early detection and diagnosis is what did that for me. Happy days.
Thank you so much to Terry for sharing that uplifting story and insight with us. And this early detection roadmap was created to ensure that we can hear more stories like Terry's. So a huge thank you to Terry and to Patrick for sharing their personal and touching stories with us today, and also a big thank you to our incredible speakers and panelists, to Peter, Susan, Jodie, Fergus and Caroline, for the engaging discussion. And crucially, a huge thank you to all of you for taking the time to be with us today, to learn more about the roadmap and for participating so fully in the discussion. And thank you so much for all the questions that you submitted. I'm so sorry we didn't get to them all. We were flooded with a lot of fantastic questions. And if there's any follow-up on those, if you wish to get in touch with Cancer Research UK for any questions that weren't answered, please use the email address that's up on screen there. You can download your copy of the roadmap at any time by heading to cruk.org/EDD-roadmap. If you're interested in hearing more about opportunities through Cancer Research UK for engaging in our early detection programme and participating in collaborative research opportunities, do contact us through the email address on screen there. And lastly, we're going to be hosting another virtual event around the roadmap on the 10th of February. Which will be focusing on the kind of implementation, health system and policy aspects, and registration will be opening up for that soon, so watch this space. Thanks again for joining us. Have a fantastic day, and let's all work together to really make early detection and diagnosis a reality. Thank you.